So my production manager actually sent me something, but I did have a note about very quickly, and it talks about this whole idea. You said that this is criminal. Let's talk about these isolation and quarantine camps, because you have spoken on those and you've asked direct questions about
Yeah.
them.
Next question, the member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Premier. In my supplemental question yesterday, I asked this government if the people of Ontario should prepare for internment camps. In September, the federal government posted a call for expressions of interest. So, Speaker, to the Premier, where will these camps be built? How many people will be detained? And for what reasons? For what reasons can people be kept in these isolation camps? And I'd like to have the Premier assure the people of Ontario.
Member, take a seat.
Okay, so what we've seen throughout this whole time is this haste and this rush and a lack of communication and a lack of evidence of what government is doing. It's just like, here's another edict, here's another law. And during this time, I saw that the federal government brought out this request for expressions of interest and request for proposals that they're planning on putting up some quantity of isolation and detention accommodations or facilities, or however you want to describe them. And they're from coast to coast and in our northern territories as well. And what really struck me, Simone, was they didn't identify how many they were going to make. They didn't identify where they were going to put them. They didn't identify how many people would be in these isolation or detention or quarantine facilities. But what was most disconcerting to me is they didn't have any precise language about who would be in these facilities.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to, I don't know what number video and interview we are with this series, but I am, of course, happy to be here today to bring to you again someone else who is standing up for our human rights, and not just in Canada, but internationally. Obviously, he is here in Canada, but we've had people from all over the world who are standing up and saying there's something about this COVID-19 pandemic that's not right. And not just is it not right, but it's really going against a lot of our constitutional rights, our human rights. So for years, Randy Hillier has been an advocate for the rights of rural communities across the province. As a representative of the Lanark, Frontenac, and Kingston regions, he has questioned the Premier and his approach to handling the current pandemic. He has long been a thorn, and I say this because I've been watching a lot of his videos, and I can see like people just not impressed when he speaks, but there's a reason for that. Since May, he's been opposed to many of the contradictory COVID-19 laws that have been passed. And today we have him on the show because he remains an advocate for the people, and he's here to share some of his knowledge with what he knows that's going. Because remember, this is someone who's working within the government. So he's seeing a lot and hearing a lot, and he's here to share that with us today. So I would like to welcome to the show, Randy Hillier. Hello.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Simone, and it's a pleasure to talk about something very, very important to so many people, to everybody in our cities, in our province, our country, and indeed the Western world. We're in a very bizarre and never before seen time. So
Yes.
Lovely to be on with you today.
Thank you. So I have like 2 to 3 pages full No, because as I was telling you, I sat down, I've just been watching you. And our team here, we're very impressed and we're very thankful to you for the fact that you're just standing up. Like, you could just be rolling over and doing what everyone else is telling you to do, but you're saying, no, this is not good. So I'm going to go through a few different things that have occurred since May. And I kind of want to get your background on it. And at the very end, I definitely want to talk about what we as a community can do so that we are not continued to be like oppressed, because that's what it is now. It's just oppression. It's past just lockdown. So let's talk about first this PCR test that is now being used, of course, because all these numbers are going up. So they're using this test to see if people have COVID. Can you give me just a little information on what you know about this PCR test?
Okay, so there's a few elements of this, but we'll start off. The PCR test was not designed as a diagnostic test. First off, it was designed as a screening test. And second to that, I should say this: back in July, our Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, Barbara Yaffe, stated on the record that this test will result in sometimes greater than 50% false positives.
You know, I think a lot of people think that testing is going to really solve the whole problem, and it isn't. It's one component of a response. If you test somebody today, you only know if they're infected today. And in fact, if you're testing in a population that doesn't have very much COVID, you'll get false positives almost half the time. That is, the person actually doesn't have COVID, they have something else, they may have nothing.
There was a bit of, there was some back and forth, but that was what her statement was.
Okay.
Since then, we've also seen some really, really preeminent scientists and medical professionals state that the PCR test will result in most, if not all, positive test results are false.
Okay, I can take that easily. Now, as you know, they're going around the country using this swab test where they use a technique called PCR. PCR is a molecular biology technique, and it involves a terrific amount of amplification over and over and over again. Now, that technique is well known to produce a risk, at least, of false positives. That is, it comes up positive even though the virus is not present. Now, people like Professor Carl Hennigan in Oxford has been banging the drum on this for ages, that they should not use this protocol without revision. Now, let me tell you, Julia, last week, the government put out an edict to revise the PCR protocol so that weak positives will be retested. But there was no media on this. This is a major U-turn because, let me just say this, were it not for the test data that you get on the TV all the time, you would rightly conclude that the pandemic was over and nothing much is happening. Of course, some people go to hospital. We'd be moving into the autumn flu season. But remember, I've said there's no science that suggests a second wave should happen at all, and didn't with prior
Go back
coronavirus.
over, for those of us who are not medical experts, just in terms of the swab test, PCR, these are the tests that people are getting when you go to, you're in the community, you think, oh, I've got a bit of a persistent cough, got a temperature, I might have been in contact with someone, I'll go and get one of these tests that the government's made available. And we know there are some false positives, but we also, the concern is that a lot of these are what are called weak positives. The way they are carrying out these tests, they are able to detect the tiniest trace of the virus, which may be months and months old. So these people may well have had the virus, may have come in contact with it months ago.
But they don't have it now.
They don't have it now. They're not infectious. They're not at risk of infecting anyone else or themselves getting ill. But we are basing a government policy, an economic policy, a civil liberties policy in terms of limiting people to 6 people at a meeting and that, all based on what may well be completely fake data about the spread of the virus. Hold on, okay. But why? Listen, we've got very eminent people, chief medical officer, chief scientific advisor. People are going to be shouting at the radio right now, saying, "Hold on a minute, you may well have eminent, qualifications, Mike. But why do you think you know more than them? Do you think they know this as well, but they're carrying on anyway, or do you think they have honest reason to believe that we are in a second wave and we're about to start it?"
Yes, when this episode started, it was entirely fine when 30% of the samples were genuinely positive and people were ill. It wasn't a problem that maybe half or 1% were false positives. It didn't matter. But I'm afraid now the ONS survey shows that the general prevalence of the virus, how many people have it in the community, is about 10 times lower than the false positive rate. To say it again, when you run the test, you'll find 10 times more false positives than actually exist in reality.
So that was Dr. Michael Yeadon, who was a chief scientist at Pfizer, the pharmaceutical giant, and also Professor Dr. Carl Hennigan at the Journal for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford, have both stated that. And how it works is they take a test sample and they run it through this machine and they amplify and amplify it. Each time they cycle it, it amplifies the sample material. Public Health Canada and most jurisdictions say any testing above 25 cycles will result in more dubious results. We found out in Ontario we're doing 38 to 45 amplification cycles.
Oh, wow.
So, and how I'll say this. So, Ontario has said that our error rate is about 1%.
Okay.
But that applies to the total amount of tests done. So if you, for example, you do 50,000 tests in a day, you will have, with a 1% error rate, you'll have 500 false positives. That's just we're not sure what the error rate. In the UK, they're saying it's between 1% and 4%. Ontario is saying that it's 1% or give or take. But we have no really science to back up that statement. But even at 1%, with the amount of testing we're doing each day in Ontario, we should be expecting 400 to 500 false positives at a minimum. So, but here's the crux of it: we know that we have false positives. The deputy minister, chief medical officer, has stated so, and we're basing all these decisions about our lockdowns and our restrictions on our freedoms and the isolation and confinement and fear in people on something that we know is so error prone. Like nobody with a critical mind, nobody with a mind that has been educated beyond, the primary grades would say, well, we should impact society based on something that we know is false.
Right.
And how do we get there? It astonishes me, and it's also what astonishes me, Simone, is these were numbers that were stated in a press conference to all our mainstream media.
Right.
Supposedly creme de la creme of our journalists are there, from CTV, from CBC, from the Globe, from the Toronto Star, and not one of them questioned. Okay, so we have 50% false positives. Carry on. Next question.
And we trust these people to give us information that's supposed to help us.
Yeah. And every time you go through any of these absolutely fundamental contradictions, nobody in the media seems to care about it. Like, okay, well, there'll be another press conference tomorrow, and there'll be more contradictions, and there'll be more falsehoods, and there'll be more misunderstanding. But let's tell people to be scared. Let's tell people to be fearful. Let's keep them isolated. Let's keep them confined. And just, we've really lost any sense of compassion or empathy for the hardship and the harm that we're doing to people in society.
Right.
And I can't explain it. That we know Canadians are compassionate people. They're understanding people. They're tolerant and accommodating. And and we're just saying, well, all those people out there that were harming and were hurting and causing such fear in their lives, well, let's just dismiss that and keep focused on how many false positives, how many cases that we have, and how much
Right.
fear we generate. It's unexplainable to me.
You know what? Let's talk a little bit more about these contradictions since we're there. What else? And I love when you speak in house. It's you just see people foaming at the mouth. Like, how is that for you?
I, I just speak, the way I was grew up to speak, um, and I grew up in a time and era that we were expected to have opinions, and we were supposed to think before we spoke, and we are supposed to listen as well.
Right.
And but at the end of the day, you're supposed to think and express your observations and your experience, and now, of course, that's the other big um, uh, contradiction during these times is any alternative view or any dissenting opinion is immediately struck down and censored. I did an interview with Stephen LeDrew last week, and I thought it was a pretty good interview.
Right.
um, but he put it up on YouTube this week, and YouTube took it down.
Oh, get used
Like
to that.
well, but this is a conversation about public policy by someone who's in public office with somebody who has been in the main of public life in Canada. And I can tell you, Simone, there was no coarse language, there was no foul language, there was um, it was two people conversing about what we're seeing in life, and that's deemed to be offensive and a violation um, of YouTube's terms of service. We can't live like that. Uh, we can't ever expect to have good policies if we're not allowed to have conversations about
Right.
how these policies impact people.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. So what
Yeah.
other contradictions have we have we
Oh,
seen? Let's go to the
well,
closest one, Thanksgiving. Let's talk about that.
well, there's Thanksgiving, but there is another one that hasn't been examined much and hasn't been discussed at all in the mainstream media and that's this. We've had public health communicating these messages of fear and apocalyptic outcomes and dire predictions and models, and telling people to um, remain isolated, remain confined, and they've been going to, and furthermore, they've been telling people not to do things that we know are healthy, right?
Yes.
And that to be safe from the virus is more important than being healthy. So we've closed our gyms, we closed our parks, our provincial parks, our recreational trails. We told kids that they can't go out and play basketball, by themselves in an empty parking lot. That taking your dog for a walk on a trail was too dangerous.
Right.
And I think there's been a real conflation of the words safety and healthy, because at no time during this have they told people, um, you know, the risk of a virus transmission increases when you're inside. If you're outside getting fresh air, that's
That's
better
better
for
for
you.
you. Yes.
You know, my parents told me that when I was really, really small. Get outside, get some fresh air, get some sunlight on you, and eat healthy, and
Absolutely.
make sure you're getting vitamin C and vitamin D, and get some exercise. All those things that we know are healthy were banned, and we were told that they were unsafe to do. Um, and like and it was just a complete absence by public health and all our government agencies and institutions to convey a message of, what can you do in a positive way
Right.
to keep healthy, because we know if you're healthy, then your immune system is going to be better stable and better able to react.
They kept liquor stores open.
Well, again, another contradiction. You couldn't go to the farmers market, but you could go to the LCBO. You couldn't go to Alcoholics Anonymous or any of the rehab programs, but you could go to the pub,
Right.
or to the beer store. Like everything, and I mean this. It was just about everything was a contradiction. And going back to you mentioned Thanksgiving. So here, you can't get together, have more than 10 people in your house. But it's okay to be on an airplane with 200 people in very close confined. Well, how does that work? How can it be unsafe for me to have my family over at Thanksgiving I've got a nice size house. You can easily be more socially distanced than you can be on an airplane.
Right.
But we're saying you can take the airplane in, and as long as you go quarantine afterwards, or if it's a flight within the province or within the country, you don't have to quarantine either. So, there's just way too many contradictions. And again, one of the most important elements of public health, one of the most important determinants of public health, is our social interactions.
Yes.
We know if people are engaged, that they have friends, that they can socialize and maybe go for a dance or a party and have healthy engagements. That's good for our mental health. It's good for our overall health. And we're being told, well, this is dangerous.
Right.
And you can go through all those things. We know access to medical care is a really important determinant of public health. But we've closed all our family doctors' offices.
Mm-hmm.
We closed off many of our access to healthcare in our hospitals. I know here's a number that was astonishing to me. Between the 3 months between March to beginning of June, there was 5.6 million fewer medical diagnostics done in our province. Okay?
Wow.
That's everything from ultrasounds and MRIs, X-rays, blood work, all the diagnostic components to help us know and treat and understand what's happening to our health. Well, they were all, they were gone. And we see, there was over 200,000 needed medical procedures that were not done in those 3 months. One of the most heartbreaking ones to me, Simone, was, and this happened early on after the state of emergency. I had this woman call me up, and she was in tears, and she was just beside herself, and she didn't know what to do. And her 58-year-old husband, who needed a live liver transplant, was told he can't get it because a live liver transplant requires the use of 2 ventilators. And bear in mind, our hospitals were empty, our emergency rooms were empty. There was, the surge never came, but they were told because the ventilators are only to be used for COVID patients, that they could not get a liver transplant. So, how can we do this? How can we say to somebody, yes, your liver transplant, you need one, but it's not as important as the coming surge. It's not as important as what may happen. And we just discarded what is happening
Right.
for what may happen. And so there was so many of these contradictions that
Yes. The hospital one's a big one.
yeah,
They were saying that hospitals were overwhelmed, for example, in Ottawa. And the chief executive officer came out and said that they didn't have more than like 2 people in ICU.
well, they had 2 people. They never had more than 2 people with COVID in the ICU unit, and I forget what it was, but I think I may be off by a little bit. But I believe they have about 100 ICU beds in Ottawa. Um,
Right.
so if you're getting overwhelmed with 2, what like how can that be? And so that was the same week that the chief medical officer of health for Ottawa was ringing the alarm bells, was declaring panic throughout the city that the hospitals were being overwhelmed, and the chief executive officer for the Ottawa hospital says, "Oh well, yeah, we have 2 people in ICU, and never more." Well, either. Uh, either somebody doesn't know how to add and subtract 132 from 100, or or they're lying or something. Like I wouldn't declare that a pandemic, a panic condition.
Right. It's
But
crazy.
again, nobody called out. Nobody from the media in Ottawa
Yes.
called them out and said, please, medical officer health, explain why we're in this panic mode. And it was the same thing. A couple of weeks ago, the Minister of Long-Term Care, Marilee Fullerton, compared long-term care, the deaths in long-term care, as comparable to a bad flu season.
Yes.
And I don't think she's too far off. There's certainly been more deaths, and of course, long-term care has been where more than 2/3 of all our fatalities have happened. But if it's a comparable to a bad flu season in our hardest hit areas, why are we reacting like there's the apocalypse happening in our restaurants or in our gyms? Like, well, that can't be so.
Lock down everything.
Lock
There's
down everything.
2 people in the ICU. Lock
Yeah.
everything down.
Yeah. Like, why? The evidence is so overwhelming that, we have a virus. That's okay. But it's also so overwhelming that the evidence is overwhelming that it's not, for 99% of the people, it's not very severe. We know 80%, and Doug Ford has stated this on the record as well. 80% of all the people who test positive don't have any symptoms.
What you mentioned, Cynthia, the more hospitals we're talking to, they're saying that close to 70 and sometimes 80% of the cases, people have no symptoms at all. They're anxious, and
Okay. So how serious is this?
Right.
Like if you have to get tested to know that you're sick, just how serious is it? Now, but of course we know if you're elderly, if you've got significant other illnesses or chronic illnesses, if you're obese, if you've got high blood pressure, and you're over 80, yeah, it can be a killer.
Yes. We've
like
acknowledged that for sure.
yeah, and but one of the things that we're not acknowledging about our elderly is how much the isolation and the confinement and the lack of access to their loved ones,
Yeah.
how much of that fear is contributing to the deaths
Right.
in long-term care. And and I don't, I was talking to Dr. Amani today, and like she's beside herself. She's taking her parents out of long-term care in Toronto this weekend because they've been confined in their rooms for weeks on end. They're not allowed to get a shower. They're not allowed to have video calls, like and can you imagine being, at any age, but if you're in your 80s or and very elderly, and being subjected to confinement and isolation, and like I know I would. I don't know how it would impact me, but I know it would be very hurtful for me to be denied to see my kids,
Right.
or my grandkids, and I think it would be hard on them. And so, thankfully, she's got the capacity and the ability to remove her
That's good.
parents from long-term care, but not everybody
Can do that.
can do that.
Yeah.
And so there's some really disturbing, I don't know. I would not call that protecting our elderly,
No,
when we do that to them.
not at all. You mentioned Bill. Sorry, you mentioned our Premier Doug Ford, and there's a bill that I saw, Bill 218. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
The member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, the passage of Bill 218 will mark a very dark moment in our history. It'll mark a very ugly milestone in our history. As 170 years ago, the people of Ontario demanded responsible government, and they got it. Bill 218 ends responsible government as we know it. Bill 218 undermines and makes a mockery of the concept of ministerial responsibility. Bill 18 allows the government to conceal any incompetence, any wrongdoing, or any consequence or any remedy for incompetence and wrongdoing. These are not the hallmarks of a responsible government. Let's remember, they have killed the concept of a public inquiry to find out why those thousands of elderly people died prematurely in our long-term care. They've prevented people from learning and understanding what and how their actions may have contributed to the outcomes of COVID and their policies. They've also now removed any civil remedy for anybody who has felt that their policies may have been a contributing factor to the premature death of the elderly. Okay? This government, and some people may laugh about 2,000 deaths over on the other side. I don't laugh about it. I think it's a tragic consequence of what this government has done. And they are refusing to allow anyone to have any scrutiny over their actions. Speaker, this bill is called Supporting Ontario's Recovery Act. It is better stated as concealing government actions through COVID.
Yeah, that was a disturbing bill, and I guess to give it some context, we know that there's been excess deaths in long-term care, and we know a whole bunch of things that may have contributed to that at the direction of the provincial government, and maybe I'll speak to some of those afterwards. But the Premier announced instead of announcing a public inquiry into what happened in long-term care, they've announced that they've hired a bunch of friendly experts who will look at things and then make a report back to the legislature. not an ideal inquiry by any means. It's certainly can't be seen as impartial or unbiased or inquisitive when you hire your friends to scrutinize what your actions were. But as bad as that was, last week they tabled a bill, Bill 218, which prevents any remedy for any wrongdoing in long-term care or any other element from proceeding with civil remedies. And I know this to be true. Like, there's a lot of people who had started legal actions against some of our long-term care facilities
Yes.
for what they saw as negligence, being understaffed, being overcrowded, not having PPE available, a whole host of different things.
Yes.
And I've spoke with many directly. Remember speaking with one lady here in my constituency who had 3 of her grandparents die in the same long-term care home. And so there was legal action started, and there's 2 things with legal actions. First off, it requires disclosure so we can actually see who did what and when.
Right.
And then you have the aspect of remedies, either financial or whatever. So Bill 218 kills any inquisition, any inquiry into the actions, and provides complete blanket protection against anybody involved with long-term care and COVID, okay, or any other elements of COVID. And if you've started an action and you've already spent $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to start it, well, that's too bad. It's gone, and there's no recourse. So you, like, this is astonishing. We're saying to the public that we're not going to understand fully what went wrong in long-term care. We're going to keep that concealed, and we're not going to allow anybody to bring forth a court action to seek remedy for whatever the wrongdoing may be. And I'll just say this to some of your viewers who may not be aware. At the beginning of the state of emergency back March 17th, we took 1,000 elderly, sick patients in our hospitals and moved them into overcrowded long-term care facilities, and that were understaffed. So that's like throwing a ticking time bomb into
Right.
long-term care, taking sick elderly people and jamming them in and overcrowding them even more. Then the government brought out a directive that if you had people in long-term care, residents in long-term care, who were exhibiting symptoms of COVID, they would not be allowed to be admitted into hospital. So, okay. And then here, another one that was really, really bizarre and puzzling, the Ontario Medical Association, the group, the umbrella group for all our physicians in Ontario, entered into negotiations with the Ministry of Health to provide physicians at each of our long-term care homes to provide medical direction, medical advice, assessments, and the Ontario government rejected their offer. Okay, and keep this in context. Most of our family doctors and most of all our doctors were idled at that time. Our hospitals were not being utilized. Family physician practices were closed up and not allowed to accept patients. So all these doctors were saying, okay, well, we can put our time to better use. We can go into long-term care and make up these assessment teams. And the Ontario government rejected that on April 7th, I believe it was April 17th. And then, like, days afterwards, they called in the military. So they had been negotiating for weeks with the OMA, and they failed to do so. And you got to say, oh, why did they do that? Like, we knew there was a problem.
Right.
And the premier was coming out every day, giving us the slogans. We're going to put the iron ring around our long-term care, and we're, and at the same time, his minister of health, is failing to utilize an offer from our family physicians. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of those things. But
Yes.
now, without the public inquiry and with this atrocious Bill 218, we'll never actually get to see the agendas, the minutes, the discussions, the conversations about what went on behind the scenes at
Right.
the COVID table in the Ministry of Health. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, it is, if they did as well as they're telling us that they did, they should be willing to open up and say, here's all the evidence. Look
Right.
how bloody well good we did.
Right.
Instead of saying, we did so bloody well, we're going to keep everything hidden from you. And we're not going to let anybody else.
Something just is not adding up. And this is really why I had you come on today, because you can speak from the inside, like, out. Like, a lot of us have no idea about some of these things, right?
Well, and that's right. It's sort of been like this. There's not only has there been a constant barrage in this relentless, tsunami of fear from the media, but there's also been just a constant, relentless change in rules and regulations every day.
Every day.
Different rules and different regulations, and today I can have a wedding, but tomorrow I can't.
Right.
Today I can have my gym open, tomorrow I can't. And it's just been this constant, ever-changing system with no stability, no certainty. So, how do you keep track of that as an individual? Like, it's
It's a lot.
well, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Like this is my job, and I live and work it 24/7, and it's still impossible to keep up with all the changes.
Right.
I've got a pretty good, but and I certainly can't expect somebody who is trying to put food on their table and trying to get their kids to school and not have to go to the COVID assessment center to get their kids tested because they've got sniffles, or that they have to go get tested because they want to see for work or whatever. And and life is hard enough as it is. In the normal situation, how would we ever expect people to also stay on top of all this ever-changing environment that we're subjecting them to?
Right. Which is probably why a lot of them just succumb to it. They acquiesce to it, and they say, okay,
Yeah.
this is just another one. Hopefully it's going to get better.
Yeah. And what's it going to be tomorrow? Who knows?
Right.
So,
Well, I do want to know what your thoughts on for us as a community, like how I know you have some petitions right now
I do.
against lockdowns and against masks. So let's talk about that, and then just give us maybe your final words on how we, like, for the people who are paying attention to this interview today, what can we do to stand up against this? For a lot of these small business owners, for the gyms, how can they stand up and say, no, this is too much, and actually be heard?
well, listen, I think the law is being used in an abusive fashion, first off, Simone. And I'm not sure if you're aware. I challenged the premier to arrest me, to charge me.
Doug Ford and the Conservative caucus, unfortunately, because I used to sit in that caucus and I know many of them, introduced emergency orders, circumvented the authority of the Legislative Assembly, circumvented the responsibility of elected members, and is acting as an authoritarian in our province. And he's done this with no demonstrable merit or cause or purpose Right? And I'll say this, I'll say it loudly and clearly for everybody to understand. We now know, unlike in March, we now have evidence, not just exaggerated projections, not just failed mathematical models. We have hard data and evidence. But we're acting as if we still don't know anything other than exaggerated projections and models. So here's a fact. More than 99% of the people are not at risk of COVID. That's a fact. And we know even that less than 1% who are at risk, 99% of them will recover or not have any symptoms at all. Our policies must be focused on those who are vulnerable, not the healthy, not the people who are not at risk, and we cannot harm the 99 in the process of protecting the one. Okay? These are not exclusive concepts. These are not ideas that we can only do one and not the other. We have and we can and we must do both. Freedom and protecting of the elderly and the vulnerable. I could go on at length, because what we've done with the elderly and the vulnerable is nothing short of tragic and travesty. But the purpose we're here today, Doug Ford has used public opinion to silence and to remove our freedoms and responsibilities. He has not, and I have challenged him today to send out Toronto bylaw, send out the Toronto Police. I am the host, I am the organizer. I want them to exercise the unlawful laws that he has enacted. We can't debate it in the legislature because of Doug Ford. I want to argue it in the court of law. And I know he will lose.
And we will win.
Yes. And we, all of us, will win. He knows he will lose, and that's why he's not here today. That's why bylaw is not here today. They want you to be scared, they don't want you to test the law. They don't want to enforce the law. They just want you to be scared of the law. Doug Ford, we're not cowards like you are. We're not yahoos like you are. We know why we're here, and we're proud to be here. But if he doesn't come, if bylaw doesn't come, then we have something even more powerful. We have something more powerful. We can proudly, legitimately tell our friends, our neighbors, we can tell everybody, Doug Ford will not enact or will not enforce his own laws. He is scared of us.
And I challenged him in the legislature. I said, throw the book at me.
Yeah.
Come out and get this Yahoo. And I gathered together with about 150 or 200 people outside in a public park in Toronto.
Yes.
We weren't protesting. There was no signs. There was no yelling or screaming. But we talked about our freedoms. We talked about our personal responsibilities. And I said, come and get me, Doug. And he wouldn't. And that's, I think there is an attempt. I think the Premier understands his laws are not valid, that they're not constitutional, and he just wants people to obey obey them, but he doesn't want anybody to test him in a court of law. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to argue that these laws were invalid. And I see this all the time. He won't have the laws tested in court because they'll strike him down quickly. So I do have petitions for against mandatory masking, against the lockdowns, against the emergency powers that Ford has vested with himself. And those are all available on my website, randyhillier.mpp.com. I will tell you, one of the big things here that is happening, Simone, is people don't have many avenues or podiums for them to speak out for themselves. Right? The mainstream media is not allowing dissenting views to be heard. Their elected representatives are too afraid to speak out in defense of our freedoms and our responsibilities. But I will share this with your audience. I understand there's another group of people who have started a province-wide lawn sign campaign. It's called nomorlockdowns.org. I believe it's starting today, where people will be able to get a lawn sign that says no more lockdowns, put it on their front yard, put it in their front window, put it in the back window of their car or wherever they might, and start having a voice once again, so that they show people that that they are disagreeing to this life of contradictions and this life of, I would say, it's oppressive what we're doing, and I think it's borders on criminal what we're doing to people. So that's just, and I think it's important. There's a lot of people who have been fearful of speaking out for fear of, public backlash and whatnot. But you have to speak out.
Yes.
That's our, as free people, as responsible people, as people with families and friends, and we need to speak out. And I would say, I grew up in a small family-owned TV business in Ottawa, and I know, my mom and dad ran this business. There was 9 kids in my family. That was their only means to put a roof over our heads, put food on the table. And if anybody had ever come and told my dad that he was not going to be able to put food on his table because they wanted his business closed, well, I can tell you, watch out. And I think that's what our business community have to say. I am not going to allow my government to sacrifice themselves and their families and their future in destroying a lifetime of work and endeavors. We're just not going to accept it. And
Yes.
come in, and I'll say this out to everybody as well. There are lots of people who would be willing to help with legal challenges and legal battles and raising money. And we need, it's like this when, if there's a bully in the schoolyard, that bully, if you keep backing up, if you keep backing away from that bully just gets bigger and bigger.
That's right.
Right? But as soon as somebody gives them a punch in the nose,
They back down.
They back down.
Yes.
And we have to start giving Doug Ford and the COVID command table and David Williams a punch in the nose.
I'm picturing it, which is why I'm laughing. I'm seeing it happen. So my production manager actually sent me something, but I did have a note about very quickly, and it talks about this whole idea. You said that this is criminal. Let's talk about these isolation and quarantine camps, because you have spoken on those and you've asked direct questions about them. Let's talk about that really briefly before we.
Next question, the member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Premier. In my supplemental question yesterday, I asked this government if the people of Ontario should prepare for internment camps. In September, the federal government posted a call for expressions of interest for contractors to supply, provide and manage quarantine isolation camps throughout every province and every territory in Canada. These quarantine isolation camps, however, are not limited to people with COVID, but provide a wide latitude for many people to be detained. Surely this government is aware of the intentions to build these isolation camps from coast to coast. And my question to the Premier is, how many of these camps will be built, and how many people does this government expect to detain?
Question. Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is very true that when people leave the country and when they come back in, that the province is suggesting, and the federal government, in cooperation with the federal government, we are suggesting that people isolate themselves. That has been a practice that has been very successful, not only here in the province of Ontario, but across Canada. And we will, of course, be redoubling our efforts to make sure that the people of the province of Ontario remain safe, Mr. Speaker. So if the member is referring to the fact that that one of the public health policies is that when you return from a jurisdiction outside of the province of Ontario or from another country, that you isolate yourself for 2 weeks, I would suggest that has been a good policy that has been working. In fact, this House has been doing the same thing since we came back. We are working in cohorts to make sure that the Legislative Assembly can continue to operate. That's why we have 2 separate cohorts, Mr. Speaker.
Response.
And with the cooperation of the official opposition, that is why all members of the Independents have been excluded from that cohort, because we want them to be able to participate in debate. So we will continue to do everything in our power to make sure that this House continues, but that the people of the province of Ontario and Canada are kept safe.
Supplementary question.
Again, back to the Premier. Here's the RFP, and in the RFP it uses clear language to express that these camps can be used for a broad spectrum of people, not limited to travellers. Indeed, it doesn't even mention international travellers. It's just a broad latitude of people. And I'll send over the copy of the RFP after. So your government must be in negotiations and aware of these plans to potentially detain and isolate citizens and residents of our country and our province. So, Speaker, to the Premier, where will these camps be built? How many people will be detained? And for what reasons?
Questions.
For what reasons can people be kept in these isolation camps? And I'd like to have the Premier assure the people of Ontario.
Member, take a seat.
You know, what we've seen throughout this whole time is this haste and this rush and a lack of communication and a lack of evidence of what government is doing. It's just like, here's another edict, here's another law. And during this time, I saw this, that the federal government brought out this request for expressions of interest and request for proposals that they're planning on putting up some quantity of isolation and detention accommodations or facilities, or however you want to describe them. And they're from coast to coast and in our northern territories as well. And what really struck me, Simone, was they didn't identify how many they were going to make. They didn't identify where they were going to put them. They didn't identify how many people would be in these isolation or detention or quarantine facilities. But what was most disconcerting to me is they didn't have any precise language about who would be in these facilities. And, like we know, okay, just for context and understanding, we know our provincial jails are for people who have engaged in criminal activity, but whose offense is less than 2 years of incarceration. And we know our federal penitentiaries are for those people who have engaged in criminal activities whose penalty is greater than 2 years.
Right.
Okay? Precision there. But this RFI and RFP said for COVID-19 and other for other COVID-19 related matters. Okay. Well, what does that mean?
What does that mean? Yeah.
What does that mean? And I don't know what it means.
Is it for people like us?
Who knows? But here's one of the things that I've come to learn very, very well in public life as a legislator. If the language in the legislation is not precise, if it's not clear, if it's not understandable, it will more likely be abused and interpreted in fashions that are well beyond what the expectations and the objective of the law was. Okay, so it's like the Highway Traffic Act. We say the speed limit. If it says it's 100 kilometers an hour, that's the speed limit. Okay, it's not. Well, maybe it's 50 or maybe it's 150 or we don't just put a sign on there on our highway saying drive safely. Like. We give some precise guidance. Or the alternative would be don't drive recklessly, because that would be very subjective, and
Yes.
you could be stopped for anything at the whim of a police officer.
Right.
So precision is important in law, and this doesn't have any precision. So I ask the questions, where are these going to be built in Ontario? How many of them are going to be built? How many people will they accommodate? And will the provincial government put any safeguards in place so that we actually understand what the purpose is? And of course, the speaker cut me off on that last question. And in the supplementary of that question, the government just refused to answer it. They refused to even acknowledge that I asked a question. If we want to have a responsible and accountable government, we need to understand what they're doing.
Yes.
It's not a difficult concept to, and if we don't know what they're doing, there is no possibility for us to hold them accountable.
Right. Yes.
So it's now some people in the internet world have taken added liberties with with that line of questioning, and of course I'm a conspiracy theorist because of I'm asking questions and trying to find out what are the facts and what are the truth that underlies things. But so be it.
So be it. Thank you, Mr. Hillier. Thank you so much. Again, I thanked you at the beginning, but you are doing something that has needed to be done. And I'm glad you've been doing it for as long as you have. And before we go, where can people find it? Because I think, like I was saying earlier, I sat down and watched 3 to 4 hours of your work. And it's incredible because you pull no punches. You do not hide what you're thinking. You just ask direct questions and expect direct answers, and it's really appreciated. Where can people find you?
Okay, well, my website is randyhilliermpp.com, and that's where you'll find my petitions and many of my videos and stuff. But I also have those petitions and videos available on my Facebook page, my Twitter account, Instagram, LinkedIn, all the I don't even know if I know all the different social media.
You covered most of them. You did pretty good. So I would love to invite you back. We know what this is. This is going to continue going. So I would love to have you back, like closer to the end of the year, maybe the beginning of 2021, if possible, just to
Well,
kind of
let's
see what's happened.
Well, why don't we do it in person? Are you allowed to do in-person videos?
Absolutely.
Because you
Perfect.
see, on all my videos, like most of my interviews that I do or my conversations with people are face to face. And
Beautiful.
I think this is one of the things that one of the reasons why I do that is just to show people that we indeed can be human, that we can be together,
Yes.
and you know, as FDR said many years ago, there is nothing to fear but fear itself.
That's right.
So, but yeah, I'd be happy to come back and chat another time for sure.
Okay, fantastic. You have a wonderful Friday. Thank you again for all that you do. And I'm excited for our next interview. It's going to be good.
It's been a pleasure chatting and looking forward to seeing you again.
See you soon. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye bye now.